There's a small detail buried in a brand new magazine cover story, published just this week, that quietly answers a question a lot of fans have had for the past year. How did Lisa step into a major HBO role with what looked like such natural ease, after spending more than a decade focused entirely on music? As it turns out, the seed for that wasn't planted recently. According to what Lisa shared in a new Vanity Fair cover story, it actually goes all the way back to her childhood, and the person responsible wasn't a casting director or an acting coach. It was her own mother. In this video, we're walking through exactly what Lisa revealed, how her relationship with acting evolved across decades, how it connects to the path that eventually led her to the White Lotus, and what this small but meaningful detail says about her family and her own creative journey. Let's start with where her story actually begins. Section 1, where it all started. Long before magazine covers, world tours, or HBO sets, Lisa, born Prenpriya Manoban, was a kid growing up in Thailand, eventually moving with her family to Bangkok. Like most children, she had no real sense yet of what her future would look like. What she did have, even then, was a mother actively involved in shaping the opportunities available to her, looking for ways to encourage whatever potential she saw in her daughter, even at a very young age. It's worth sitting with that context for a moment, because it's easy, looking back from where Lisa is now, to assume her path was somehow obvious or inevitable from the start. It wasn't. She was simply a child in Thailand whose mother happened to believe she had something worth nurturing, long before there was any indication that her daughter would eventually become one of the most recognized performers in the world. That's a fairly ordinary, relatable starting point for what became an extraordinary career. At 14, Lisa made the decision to move to South Korea to begin training with YG Entertainment, a path that would eventually lead to Blackpink's debut in 2016. It was an enormous, life-altering decision for a young teenager to make, leaving behind her home country, her language, and her family, in pursuit of an opportunity with no guarantee of success. That willingness to take a leap into the unknown, even at such a young age, is a thread that runs through nearly every major turning point in her career, including, as we'll see, her decision to return to acting decades later. Section 2. The Trainee Years and a Found Family. According to the same recent Vanity Fair piece, Lisa was actually the second of the 4 Blackpink members to join YG's training program, arriving after Jennie, who helped show her the ropes during those early days. Not long after, Jisoo joined as well. Despite a significant language barrier in those early months, Lisa speaking very little Korean, and the others speaking very little English, the 3 found a way to communicate and build a genuine friendship, even before they could fully understand each other's languages in any conventional sense. It's a detail that says a lot about the kind of resilience required during those early trainee years. Building real relationships across a language barrier, as a young teenager living away from your family for the first time, takes a particular kind of patience and openness, qualities that, again, seem to surface again and again throughout Lisa's career. It would be roughly a year later that Rose arrived, completing the lineup that would become Blackpink. And according to the interview, Lisa and Rose developed an especially close bond early on, largely because they were the only 2 members whose immediate families lived outside of Korea, something that gave them a particular kind of common ground the others didn't share in quite the same way. Both of them understood, in a way their groupmates couldn't quite replicate, what it felt like to build a new life and a new support system from scratch, far from the people who'd known them their whole lives. That early period, years of training, language barriers, homesickness, and building an entirely new life far from home, is the backdrop against which Lisa's relationship with her mother, and the specific revelation we're about to cover, actually makes the most sense. It's a reminder that long before she was a global pop star, she was simply a kid navigating an enormous amount of change, supported at different points by both her family back home and the new found family she was building around her. Section 3. The Vanity Fair Revelation. In the new Vanity Fair cover story published this week, Lisa opened up about something that hadn't really been part of her public narrative before, a detail from much earlier in her life, well before she ever considered a music career at all. According to the interview, Lisa shared that when she was little, her mother had wanted her to become a child actor and had enrolled her in an acting school as a result. It's a small, simple detail, but it reframes something fans had mostly only associated with her more recent career pivot into a much longer, quieter thread running through her entire life. For years, the narrative around Lisa's move into acting treated it as a relatively new development, something that emerged out of her solo career momentum and her growing visibility outside of music. This detail complicates that timeline in a meaningful way, suggesting that her relationship with acting actually began decades before the White Lotus ever entered the picture, even if it took that long to actually resurface. What makes this particular detail even more interesting is Lisa's own honesty about how she felt about it at the time. She noted that she didn't actually enjoy the experience back then, and she's described acting more broadly as something she'd long avoided trying, despite her mother's early encouragement. There's no indication in the interview of any tension or conflict around this. It reads less like a disagreement and more like a fairly ordinary parent-child dynamic. A mother who saw something in her daughter that the daughter herself wasn't especially interested in pursuing at that particular age. It's worth pausing on that honesty for a second, because it's actually a refreshing detail in itself. Lisa didn't frame this story as some kind of secret talent she'd always quietly nurtured, waiting patiently for her moment to shine. She framed it plainly and without embellishment. Her mother had a vision for her early on. She went along with it as a kid, and she didn't particularly take to it at the time. That kind of candid, unembellished version of a childhood memory tends to feel a lot more genuine than a tidier, more cinematic origin story might have, the kind where everything seems to have been building toward a single inevitable outcome all along. So if she didn't enjoy acting as a child, and didn't pursue it as a teenager moving into K-pop training, what actually changed? That's where the second half of this story picks up, more than a decade later, after an entirely different career had already been built. Section 4. Why she came back to it. Years later. By the time Lisa sat down for this Vanity Fair interview, she had spent more than 10 years as a performer, first within Blackpink, and later as a solo artist in her own right, releasing music, touring internationally, and becoming one of the most recognized K-pop idols in the world. According to what she shared, that length of time is actually part of what eventually pulled her back toward acting, after years of having no real interest in it at all. She explained that after doing the same kind of work for over a decade, there's a natural pull toward finding something new to draw inspiration from. Essentially, that. Staying creatively energized after that long in one discipline sometimes means deliberately stepping into unfamiliar territory, even if that territory once felt unwelcome. It's a fairly universal sentiment, even outside the context of entertainment. Plenty of people, regardless of their field, eventually reach a point after many years in one role where doing more of the same starts to feel less like growth and more like repetition. What's notable about Lisa's version of that feeling is where she chose to look for something new. Not toward an entirely unfamiliar skill, but back toward something she'd actually been exposed to once before, as a child, even if she hadn't enjoyed it at the time. That's exactly what led to her acting debut in 2025, when she joined the cast of HBO's The White Lotus. It was a significant moment, not just a side project squeezed in between music commitments, but her first real screen acting role, taken on at a point in her career when she'd already established herself thoroughly as a musician and performer, with little left to prove in that particular arena. Stepping into an entirely different industry, with different expectations, different collaborators, and a completely different kind of performance, was a genuine risk, the kind that's far easier to avoid once you've already built a successful, stable career doing something else. She also made an appearance at the Oscars in March of that year, placing her, even briefly, within a different entertainment circle than the one she'd spent over a decade building her name in. It was a small but symbolic marker of just how far this new chapter had already carried her, barely any time after her acting debut had aired. Section 5. Taking the leap seriously. What's worth emphasizing here is that Lisa's move into acting wasn't framed, in this interview or elsewhere, as a casual experiment she could simply walk away from if it didn't work out. According to the interview, she indicated she's open to further acting work going forward, suggesting that this chapter of her career is something she intends to keep building on, rather than treating it as a brief detour from music before returning fully to her established lane. That matters, because it reframes the entire acting school detail in a slightly different light. This isn't a story about someone dabbling briefly in a childhood hobby out of nostalgia. It's a story about someone who, after resisting a particular path for the better part of 2 decades, eventually returned to it with what appears to be genuine, sustained interest, choosing to actively develop it further, rather than treating her first role as a one-off curiosity. Section 6. Connecting the dots, without overstating it. Now, it's worth being careful here, because there's a tempting, slightly too neat way to tell this story. Her mom sent her to acting school as a kid, and decades later, she finally became an actress. It was destiny all along. That's a satisfying narrative, the kind that makes for a tidy headline. It's also not exactly what Lisa said, and it's worth being honest about that distinction rather than smoothing it over for the sake of a cleaner story. What she actually described was a mother who, years ago, saw something in her and tried to nurture it, and a daughter who, at the time, simply wasn't interested. There's no indication in the interview that this early acting school experience directly caused her later interest in The White Lotus, or that she consciously thought back to those childhood classes when she accepted the role. She didn't describe a moment of realization where the two experiences clicked together in her mind. What we can reasonably say is something a little more modest, and arguably more honest. Looking back at her own story now, it's easy to see how that early exposure, however brief, however unwelcome it felt to her at the time, may have quietly planted a seed that simply needed the right moment, more than a decade later, to actually take root. Sometimes an early experience doesn't need to be consciously remembered or referenced to have left some kind of mark. It can simply exist in the background, shaping someone's comfort level with an unfamiliar situation, without that person necessarily attributing their later choices directly back to it. That's a narrative interpretation, not a confirmed cause-and-effect relationship, and it's an important distinction to make, especially when the story involves someone's actual mother and an actual childhood experience, rather than just a tidy plot point built for entertainment. Section 7. A broader picture of her formative years. What's interesting about this particular Vanity Fair piece is that the acting school detail wasn't really the headline of the interview. It came up almost incidentally, as part of a much broader reflection on her formative years overall. The same interview is also where she discussed her early trainee days, her growing bond with Jennie and Jisoo despite the language barrier, and that especially close connection she developed with Rose, built specifically around both of them being far from their families during a formative, often difficult period of their lives. Taken together, the picture that emerges isn't really about one single defining childhood moment. It's about a young woman who, at nearly every major turning point in her life, moving to Korea as a young teenager, training for years before debuting, and now circling back to a craft she once resisted, has had some combination of family encouragement and found family support quietly shaping the path, even when she didn't fully recognize it in the moment. Her mother's early push toward acting school is simply one thread in a much larger pattern. People around her, at different points, seeing potential or opportunity that she herself wasn't necessarily looking for at the time. It's also worth noting how this kind of detail tends to land with fans specifically. For years, longtime Blinks have known the broad outline of Lisa's journey: the move to Korea, the years of training, the eventual debut. A detail like this doesn't rewrite that story, it simply adds a small human dimension to it, reminding fans that long before any of the more familiar milestones, there was an ordinary mother in Thailand who believed in her daughter's potential before anyone else did. Section 8. What's next? And according to this same interview, her story isn't pausing here either. Lisa revealed that she's already begun working on her next solo album, meaning that even as she expands further into acting, she's not stepping away from music. If anything, this latest chapter looks less like a pivot away from her core identity as a performer, and more like an expansion of it, an artist who spent over a decade building one part of her creative identity before circling back years later to revisit a door her mother had first opened for her as a child. That dual focus, continuing to build her music career while also actively pursuing more acting opportunities, suggests she isn't viewing these as competing paths that require choosing one over the other. Instead, it looks more like two parallel threads of the same evolving creative identity, both of which, in their own way, trace back to decisions made on her behalf long before she had any say in the matter, and decisions she's now actively choosing to make for herself. So, what's the real reason behind Lisa's mother enrolling her in acting school all those years ago? Based on what Lisa herself has shared, it really does seem to come down to something fairly simple. A mother who saw a spark of potential in her daughter long before the rest of the world did, even if that daughter wasn't especially interested in following that particular path at the time. What makes this story worth telling isn't a dramatic reveal or a hidden secret. It's the quiet, almost understated way it connects two very different chapters of Lisa's life, separated by more than a decade, through nothing more than a brief, honest aside in a magazine interview. Sometimes the most meaningful parts of someone's story aren't dramatic moments at all. They're small, easily overlooked details that only make sense once you look back at the whole picture. A reluctant child actor who once resisted her mother's encouragement, eventually finding her own way back to the same craft on her own terms, decades later. If you enjoyed this look into Lisa's early years and her path back to acting, let us know in the comments what you think of this new Vanity Fair revelation. And subscribe if you'd like more carefully researched looks into the lives and journeys of your favorite K-pop stars.